Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. It's Pastor Peter Noble here from St. Martin's Lutheran Church in Gladstone in central Queensland. I'm just doing a blog today on my son's name. People have been asking me recently, my wife and I, my wife gave birth to our fourth son, and we named him Ambrose Ignatius Noble. And so the first questions I get is, oh wow, where do these names come from? And so I guess not only are these names beautiful, but it's an opportunity to teach about the history of the church and where they come from. So the names come from two early church bishops, one from the east, one from the west. And so Ambrose was a Western church father. He's from Milan in Italy, and he was a very gifted rhetorician, someone who could speak publicly, someone who had the art of persuasion. Before he was in the church, he worked for the government, and he was able to speak publicly and persuade people very well. And so if you had the gift of rhetoric and you could speak publicly like this, you had skills that were highly sought after, and you could make a lot of money through this. So that's what he did, and we know a lot about Ambrose through what Augustine says about him. And so Augustine writes about Ambrose in it was a book here called Confessions, St. Augustine Confessions. And so in the Confessions we have, this is written in the 4th century in Latin, and it's translated into English. And Augustine was a subject of Ambrose. He later became Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. This is Augustine. But before he was a Christian, he was a bit of a sex fiend, and he pursued the lusts of the flesh. And I think when his wife died, Augustine and his son went to Milan in Italy, and he was catechized under Bishop Ambrose, which means basically he went into a time of teaching and instruction. If you were to be catechized and receive catechesis, you become what's called a catechumenate. And there's a book here that is written by William Harmless, and it's called Augustine and the Catechumenate. And it's basically, to be a catechumenate means to go into a period of instruction. So it comes from the Greek word katakeo, which means to teach, to instruct. And so what are the two things that grow the church? Teaching, that is katakeo, to instruction, and baptism. And so if you want to know how the church grows, read that book, The Catechumenate. And basically the catechumenate is for those who are wanting to be baptized. Perhaps they have not joined the church as children, were baptized as infants, and they want to join. They would come into a time of instruction, and they would receive what's called the faith. And so that is the basic precepts of the church. That is the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, maybe even the Nicene Creed at this time. And you would receive these things. And when you were baptized, you would, when it came to Easter and then you go through Lent, it was a really intense spiritual time of reflecting on the things of God, reflecting on what God is doing in your life. You've been receiving teaching for a whole year. Augustine had a 3-year catechumenate, but he was 1 year in Italy, but post Italy he was basically 3 years. He would put people through a 3-year process, and you would put your name forward is the language that they would say for baptism. And before you were baptized, you would you would hand back the faith to the church. The church, this beautiful this picture of a mother has taken you in at her breast, and she has suckled you milk, which is the foundations of the faith, and you have received that, and you give that faith back to the church. You confess it with your lips. So you would stand up publicly and you would say the 10 Commandments. You might confess the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. You would confess it publicly and say, this is what I believe, this is what I confess. And so that's where we get the word credo from. It's Latin for I believe. So if you have a creed, credo is where it comes from. It's what you believe, but it's not just what you believe, it's what you confess. It's what you pronounce with your lips. And so this is Lutherans and the Lutheran Church is a very confessional church. So, what can I tell you about Ambrose? Well, where are we? I think I had a page here of Augustine when he went to Milan, and I'm just going to bring it up for you. It's basically when he was hearing Ambrose preaching, page 91. I encourage you to read these confessions. They're really, really good. 91. Here we go. Check this out. This is when Augustine came to Milan in Italy. To Milan I came, to Ambrose the bishop, known to the whole world as among the best of men, thy devout servant, whose eloquent discourse did then plentifully dispense unto thy people the flour of thy wheat, the gladness of thy oil, and the sober inebriation of thy wine. To him was I unknowing led by thee, that by him I might knowingly be led to thee. That man of God received me as a father, and shewed me an episcopal kindness on my coming. Thenceforth I began to love him. At first, indeed, not as a teacher of the truth, which I utterly despaired of in thy church, but as a person kind towards myself. So notice how he wasn't won over because he was a teacher of the church, which he as a non-Christian technically, he hated that thing, but because he was shown love and grace towards Augustine. And I listened diligently to him preaching to the people, not with that intent I ought, but as it were, trying his eloquence. So he's basically evaluating him as a public speaker, whether it answered the fame thereof, or flowed fuller or lower than was reported. And I hung on his words attentively. But of the matter I was as a careless and scornful onlooker, and I was delighted with the sweetness of his discourse, more recondite, yet in manner less winning and harmonious than that of Faustus. That must be another public speaker. Of the matter, however, there was no comparison, for the one was wandering amid Manichean delusions. That's an early church heresy schism, the Manicheans. The other teaching salvation most soundly. But salvation is far from sinners, such as I, then stood before him, and yet was I drawing nearer, little by little, and unconsciously. So what is Augustine saying? He's saying that when Ambrose preached, he said, man, my heart was being drawn to God. I was unconsciously being drawn in as a sinner by the grace of God. And not because, even though he was a fine speaker, but you can see that Ambrose was gracious and kind, that it was not through his lofty words that persuaded Augustine to become a Christian, but it was through his kindness. He accepted Augustine as a father. It's almost like it sounds like he's giving Augustine more respect than Ambrose had himself in his office as a preacher and a minister of God and a bishop in the church. So there you go. Confessions of St. Augustine. Read that, man. It'll blow your mind. Get a hold of Augustine and the Catechumena, another excellent book. Goes into great detail about catechesis and instruction, and Ambrose's techniques in catechizing Augustine. The second name my son was called was Ignatius, and so Ignatius was a 2nd century bishop. And Ignatius, what do we know about him? Well, we only know he existed through 7 letters. Wait, can I get 7 fingers there? 7 letters that were written to 7 churches, and he wrote these on the way to Rome from Antioch because he was arrested and he was being persecuted for his faith. And it's believed that he was martyred or executed by being thrown to the lions in the Roman Colosseum. Now, what do we know about Ignatius? Well, we know he had great faith, and we know that he was a disciple of Christ. But it's fascinating. We only know about him what he reveals of himself in these letters. And I'm just going to read a little article here from. If you know your Greek really well, you can read the Apostolic. Can you see that? Apostolic Fathers by Bishop Lightfoot. This one's published in 1898, so it's quite old. But Bishop Lightfoot has translated, or not translated, he's basically published a lot of manuscripts by the early church fathers, and so if your Greek is not as good, you can read it in English. There it is there. And so I'm just going to read a little excerpt here from the Epistle of St. Ignatius to the Ephesians. And so this is what he writes. Just listen to what he says. I do not command you as though I were somewhat. For even though I am in bonds for the name's sake, that's Jesus' name, I am not yet perfected in Jesus Christ. What's he saying there? I'm not yet perfected. For now am I beginning to be a disciple, and I speak to you as my schoolfellows. For I ought to be trained by you for the contest in faith, in admonition, in endurance, in long-suffering. What's he saying here? Well, basically, he was on his way to be martyred for the faith, and Bishop Ignatius believed that he hadn't yet been perfected in his faith. And I think he's touching on sanctification here, being made like Christ. But he says, I've been arrested for the sake of being a Christian. That's the first thing. But he says, but I am not yet perfected in my faith. I am not yet perfected in Jesus Christ. And he says, only now when I'm about to be murdered for my faith, now when I make my confession, am I beginning to be a disciple. Only now am I beginning to speak to you as my schoolfellows. Now I'm really starting to get what it means to be a bishop, what it means to be a confessor of the faith. So you can see that's just a taste of Bishop Ignatius and his confession of the faith. There's so much more I could talk about, but that's just a taste of why why my wife and I called our son Ambrose Ignatius Noble. I hope that this has been rich and encouraging to you. I encourage you to read these books. Check them out if you get a chance. Bishop Ambrose from Milan in Italy, and Bishop Ignatius, 2nd century bishop from Antioch, a Greek early church father. This is Pastor Peter Noble. God bless you, and grace and peace. Take care.